The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and straightened his iconic bearskin hat. At 24, he had served in the Queen's Guard for 3 years, standing, motionless for hours outside royal residences, trained to ignore distractions and maintain perfect discipline no matter what happened around him. That Tuesday in October started like any other day. Thomas had completed his morning inspection, polished his boots until they gleamed, and taken his position outside the main entrance where tourists would soon gather to take photographs and try to make him smile or move. He had seen it all before. People making faces, telling jokes, even children trying to tickle his legs through the railings. Nothing had ever broken his concentration. The castle was unusually quiet that morning. Most of the senior royals were away on official duties, leaving only a skeleton staff and a few junior members of the family in residence. Thomas knew Prince George, now 10 years old, was spending the school holidays at Windsor with his nanny, while his parents attended a state dinner in Scotland. As Thomas stood at attention, his rifle held perfectly vertical against his shoulder, he noticed movement in one of the upper windows. A small figure appeared briefly behind the glass. Unmistakably Prince George, still in his pajamas despite it being nearly 10 in the morning. The boy seemed to be watching the changing of the guard ceremony that was taking place in the courtyard. Thomas had encountered the young prince before during his duties. George was known among the staff for being curious and friendly, often asking the guards questions about their uniforms and duties when protocol allowed. Unlike some royal children, George seemed genuinely interested in the people who protected his family, remembering their names and always saying please and thank you. But today something was different. As Thomas maintained his rigid pose, he caught sight of Prince George pressing his face against the window glass, his breath fogging the pain. The boy was trying to get someone's attention, waving his small hands frantically. Thomas assumed he was simply excited to watch the ceremony, as children often were. The tourists began arriving in greater numbers, cameras clicking and flashing as they captured images of the stoic guard. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight, a head trained to be a living statue. But from his peripheral vision, he could still see the window where Prince George continued his animated gesturing. What Thomas didn't realize was that the young prince wasn't just excited about the ceremony. George had been trying to get dressed for breakfast when he heard strange sounds coming from somewhere in the castle, sounds that made him feel uneasy and frightened. Being a bright child who had been taught about safety and security from an early age, he knew something wasn't right. The boy had run to his window hoping to catch the attention of one of the guards below. He trusted them completely, having been told since he could walk that these men were there to keep his family safe. But the changing ceremony was too far away, and the guards were focused on their precise movements and couldn't see him clearly. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed the prince had disappeared from the window. Perhaps he had gone to breakfast, or been called away by his nanny. The guard rotation continued as scheduled, with Thomas maintaining his post without incident. Everything seemed normal on the surface. However, inside the castle, Prince George was growing more worried by the minute. The strange noises had continued, and now he could hear what sounded like unfamiliar voices coming from a part of the building where no one should have been at that hour. His nanny had stepped out to collect his breakfast from the kitchen, leaving him alone in his room with strict instructions to get dressed and brush his teeth. The 10-year-old faced a dilemma that would challenge even an adult. He had been taught never to leave his room without permission when his parents weren't home, but he had also been taught to trust his instincts about danger. The conflicting lessons battled in his young mind as he tried to decide what to do. Looking out the window again, George spotted Thomas standing perfectly still at his post. The guard was close enough that if George could get his attention properly, he might be able to communicate that something was wrong. But how could he break through the professional barrier that required the guards to ignore all distractions? The answer came to him suddenly, and it was something only someone who truly understood the relationship between the royal family and their protectors would think of. Prince George remembered something his father had told him about the guards, that while they must ignore public attempts to distract them, they were always watching and always ready to respond to genuine signals from the family they served. What The young prince did next would test every aspect of Thomas Mitchell's training and judgment, setting in motion a chain of events that would reveal just how serious the situation inside Windsor Castle had become. The invisible bond between the royal family and their guardians was about to be put to its ultimate test. Prince George took a deep breath and pressed both palms against the window glass. Then, very deliberately, he began to tap out a specific pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps again. SOS in Morse code, something his grandfather had taught him during their private lessons about emergency procedures that every royal child needed to know. The boy repeated the pattern several times, hoping against hope that one of the guards would notice and understand. His heart was pounding as the strange sounds from within the castle grew louder. Now he could clearly hear voices, adult men speaking in hushed tones about securing the area and maintaining the timeline. These weren't the familiar voices of the castle staff he knew. From his position below, Thomas Mitchell initially dismissed the rhythmic tapping as another child trying to get a reaction. But something about the precision and repetition made him focus more carefully. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the small figure in the window hadn't given up after a few seconds like most children would. The tapping continued with determination. Then recognition hit him like lightning. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Every member of the Queen's Guard learned Morse code as part of their communication training. This wasn't random tapping. This was a distress signal being sent by a 10-year-old prince who somehow knew exactly what he was doing. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but his training held firm. He couldn't break position without proper cause, but he also couldn't ignore a potential emergency involving a member of the royal family. He needed to acknowledge the signal without alerting any potential threats that might be watching. Very slowly, Thomas shifted his weight almost imperceptibly from one foot to the other, a movement so subtle that tourists wouldn't notice, but one that Prince George would see. It was the guard's way of saying message received. The tapping at the window immediately stopped. Prince George felt a wave of relief wash over him. The guard had understood. Now he needed to convey more specific information. Remembering another lesson from his security briefings, the boy held up fingers against the glass. First 2 fingers, then 3 fingers, then 2 again. He was indicating the 2nd floor, 3rd room, 2nd corridor, the location where the strange sounds were coming from. Thomas watched this second signal with growing alarm. The prince was communicating like someone who had been properly trained in emergency protocols, which meant this wasn't a child's game or imagination. Something real was happening inside Windsor Castle, and a 10-year-old boy was the only one in position to report it. The guardsman faced an impossible decision. Royal protocol strictly forbade abandoning his post under any circumstances except direct orders from a superior officer or immediate physical threat to his own life. Breaking this rule could mean court-martial, discharge from the service, and permanent disgrace, but ignoring a genuine distress signal from a member of the royal family could have consequences far worse than any military punishment. As Thomas wrestled with his decision, Prince George disappeared from the window again. The boy had heard his nanny's footsteps returning down the corridor and knew he needed to appear normal when she entered his room. But the voices from the forbidden area of the castle were getting closer to his location, and his child's instinct told him they were running out of time. When Nanny Margaret entered with his breakfast tray, she found Prince George sitting on his bed, fully dressed, but unusually quiet. "Good morning, Your Highness," she said cheerfully, setting down the tray of toast, eggs, and orange juice. "You're very prompt getting ready today. Are you feeling well?" "Yes, Nanny," George replied, though his voice carried a tension that the experienced caregiver immediately noticed. Margaret had looked after royal children for over 20 years and could sense when something was troubling them. "Is everything all right, George? You seem a bit worried about something," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed with the maternal warmth that had made her so trusted by the family. The young prince looked into her kind eyes and made another difficult decision. "Nanny, I've been hearing voices in the castle, strange voices from places where no one should be this early, and they don't sound like our usual staff." Margaret's expression grew serious. She had been briefed on security protocols and knew that royal children were taught to report unusual observations immediately. Where did you hear these voices, George? Can you show me? Before the prince could answer, both of them heard it. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside, moving with purpose toward the main family quarters. These weren't the familiar steps of the housekeeping staff or the measured pace of the regular security detail. Margaret's training kicked in instantly. George, we need to follow the special procedures we practiced, she whispered, moving toward the window. Stay close to me. Outside, Thomas Mitchell had reached his breaking point. The child's distress signal, combined with his own subtle observations of unusual activity around the castle perimeter, convinced him that protocol had to be broken. The young prince had trusted him with a cry for help, and he could not let that trust be betrayed. Making a decision that would define the rest of his career, Thomas Mitchell took one step backward from his post, then another. For the first time in 3 years of flawless service, he abandoned his position and began moving toward the castle's main entrance. The tourists watched in amazement as the statue-like guard suddenly came to life and strode purposefully toward the building he was supposed to be protecting from the outside. Thomas Mitchell's boots echoed against the stone floor as he entered Windsor Castle through the main hall. His mind raced as he tried to process the unprecedented step he had just taken. Never in the history of the Queen's Guard had a sentry abandoned his post based solely on a signal from a child, no matter how royal that child might be. The castle's interior seemed eerily quiet compared to its usual morning bustle. Normally, staff members would be moving about their duties, preparing for the day's activities, but today the corridors felt almost deserted, which only reinforced Thomas's growing certainty that something was seriously wrong. He moved quickly but carefully toward the main staircase, his training automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes. The weight of his rifle felt reassuring against his shoulder, though he hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use it. As he climbed toward the second floor where Prince George had indicated the problem, every shadow seemed to hold potential danger. Meanwhile, in the prince's room, Nanny Margaret was following emergency protocols that most people never knew existed. She guided Prince George to a specially reinforced section of his bedroom that could serve as a safe room if needed. The area looked like ordinary furniture to casual observers, but it contained communication equipment and supplies for exactly this type of situation. "Remember what we practiced, George," she whispered as she activated a silent alarm that would alert the castle's security center. "Stay very quiet and let me handle this." The strange voices in the corridor were getting closer, and now they could make out individual words. The men were discussing Phase 2 and maintaining the schedule, using terminology that suggested this was a coordinated operation rather than a random intrusion. Prince George pressed close to his nanny, his young mind struggling to understand why anyone would want to invade his home. Despite his royal upbringing and security training, he was still a child who wanted nothing more than to feel safe in his own bedroom. Margaret activated the communication device and spoke in barely audible tones to the security center. Code red in the family quarters. Unknown intruders approaching Prince George's location. Immediate assistance required. The response crackled back immediately. "Margaret, this is Control. We show no unauthorized personnel in the building. Are you certain of the threat?" This confused response sent a chill through both the nanny and the prince. If the main security center wasn't tracking any intruders, it meant either their systems had been compromised, or the threat was coming from someone who had legitimate access to the castle. Thomas reached the second floor and began moving toward the location Prince George had indicated. The corridor seemed endless, lined with portraits of previous monarchs who seemed to watch his progress with disapproving eyes. He could hear voices now, too. Male voices speaking in professional, clipped tones that reminded him of military or security personnel. As he drew closer, Thomas recognized something that made his blood run cold. One of the voices belonged to Commander Harrison, the head of the castle's internal security detail. But Harrison wasn't supposed to be on duty today, and more importantly, he was speaking with people Thomas didn't recognize about containing the situation and ensuring no witnesses. The terrible possibility began to dawn on Thomas that Prince George might have stumbled upon something far more dangerous than a simple break-in. If members of the castle's own security team were involved in whatever was happening, then the normal chain of command couldn't be trusted. Thomas pressed himself against the wall and listened more carefully. The conversation was becoming clearer, and what he heard made him realize that abandoning his post might have been the most important decision of his life. "The boy's room is just down this hall," Commander Harrison was saying to his companions. "We need to ensure he doesn't have any opportunity to communicate with outside security before the operation is complete." "What about the nanny?" asked an unfamiliar voice. "She'll cooperate once she understands the situation," Harrison replied coldly. "And if she doesn't, we have contingency plans." Thomas felt his hands tighten on his rifle. These weren't intruders from outside the castle. This was an internal threat, possibly a coup attempt or kidnapping plot involving people who were supposed to be protecting the royal family. Prince George's instincts had been absolutely correct, and his brave decision to signal for help might be the only thing standing between him and serious danger. The guardsman knew he was now facing the most critical decision of his military career. He was outnumbered and outranked, but he had been entrusted with the protection of the royal family, and that oath superseded all other considerations. He also knew that help might not arrive in time, as the conspirators seemed to have compromised the normal security systems. Thomas quickly assessed his options. He could retreat and try to summon help from outside the castle, but that would leave Prince George and his nanny vulnerable to immediate harm. He could confront the group directly, but against multiple opponents in a confined space, his chances of success were limited. Then he remembered something from his advanced training. Sometimes the most effective defense was an unexpected offense. If the conspirators believed their plan was proceeding undetected, they wouldn't be prepared for interference from a supposedly ignorant guard who should have been standing motionless outside the building. Thomas Mitchell took a deep breath and stepped around the corner into full view of Commander Harrison and his three companions. His rifle was held at ready position, his voice steady and authoritative. "Gentlemen, I need you to step away from the family quarters immediately and explain your presence here." The silence that followed Thomas's challenge was deafening. Commander Harrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then cold calculation. The three men with him instinctively reached for concealed weapons, but Harrison held up a hand to stop them. "Guardsman Mitchell," Harrison said with forced calm, "what exactly are you doing inside the castle? You should be at your post outside." Thomas kept his rifle ready but not directly threatening, walking the fine line between assertiveness and insubordination. "I received what appeared to be a distress signal from Prince George, sir. I came to investigate and ensure his safety." One of Harrison's companions, a thin man with sharp features, spoke up with barely concealed irritation. "A distress signal? From a 10-year-old boy? Don't you think you might have been mistaken, soldier?" "Perhaps," Thomas replied carefully, "but I took an oath to protect the royal family, and I cannot ignore potential threats no matter how unlikely they might seem." Harrison studied Thomas intently, clearly trying to decide how to handle this unexpected complication. The original plan had obviously not accounted for interference from a lowly guardsman who should have been safely stationed outside the building. "I appreciate your dedication, Mitchell," Harrison said finally, "but this is a routine security exercise. We're testing response times and communication protocols. Prince George and his nanny are perfectly safe." Thomas felt his instinct screaming that this was a lie, but he also knew he was walking into dangerous territory by questioning a superior officer. "If this is a scheduled exercise, sir, shouldn't I have been briefed? And shouldn't there be documentation logged with the duty officer?" The sharp-featured man stepped forward aggressively. "Listen here, guardsman, you're way out of line questioning." Harrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "It's all right, Peterson. Mitchell is just doing his job." He turned back to Thomas with what was meant to be a reassuring smile. "The exercise was classified at a higher level than your clearance, soldier. But since you're here, you can observe and learn from it." At that moment, they all heard a sound that made Harrison's face darken with anger. The distinct noise of a communication device activating from inside Prince George's room. Nanny Margaret was clearly trying to contact someone, which meant their routine exercise explanation wasn't working. "Peterson, Davies, secure the communications," Harrison ordered his companions. We need to maintain operational integrity. Thomas watched in horror as the two men moved toward the prince's door with obvious hostile intent. This was clearly no exercise, and Prince George was in immediate danger. The young guardsman had perhaps seconds to decide whether to trust his instincts or his commanding officer. Inside the room, Margaret heard the approaching footsteps and made a desperate decision. She activated the emergency broadcast system that would send an alert directly to Scotland Yard and the Royal Protection Command, bypassing the compromised castle security entirely. "George, get behind the bookshelf now," she whispered urgently. "Remember what we practiced about the hidden passage." The prince, though frightened, moved quickly to follow her instructions. His grandfather had insisted that every royal residence have emergency escape routes that even the security staff didn't know about, and Prince George had been taught to use them from the time he could walk. As the door handle turned, Margaret positioned herself between the entrance and her young charge, determined to buy him whatever time she could to reach safety. Back in the corridor, Thomas made his choice. As Peterson reached for the door handle, the guardsman stepped forward and placed his hand on the man's arm. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't allow you to enter the prince's room without proper authorization from his parents or the duty officer." Peterson spun around with fury in his eyes. "You're interfering with a classified operation, soldier. Then show me the classified orders," Thomas replied firmly. "Show me documentation that authorizes this action, and I'll step aside immediately." Harrison's patience finally snapped. "Mitchell, you're relieved of duty. Step aside or face court. Marshal for insubordination." "With respect, sir, I can only be relieved of duty by officers I know to be legitimate. Until I see proper identification and authorization, I must assume this is exactly what it appears to be: a threat to the royal family." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Harrison nodded to his companions, and suddenly, Thomas found himself facing 3 armed men in a narrow castle corridor, with a child's life hanging in the balance. But Prince George's emergency training proved invaluable. As his nanny held the door against the intruders, he had already reached the hidden panel behind the bookshelf. The passage beyond was narrow and dark, but it led to a network of tunnels that connected to the main security station. The 10-year-old prince took one last look at his nanny, silently promising himself that he would send help back for her, then disappeared into the secret passage that might be his family's salvation. Outside in the corridor, Thomas Mitchell prepared to face the greatest challenge of his military career, knowing that every second he could buy might mean the difference between success and failure for the brave young prince who had trusted him with a desperate cry for help. The confrontation exploded into action faster than anyone could have anticipated. Peterson lunged toward Thomas, clearly intending to overpower the lone guardsman, but Thomas's years of military training kicked in automatically. He sidestepped the attack and used Peterson's momentum to send him crashing into the ornate wall paneling. Davies moved to flank Thomas from the other side, but the narrow corridor worked in the guardsman's favor. His rifle wasn't ideal for close combat, but years of weapons training had taught him how to use it effectively as both deterrent and weapon. He swung the stock in a controlled arc that caught Davies in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. Commander Harrison hung back, clearly expecting his subordinates to handle one supposedly inferior guardsman quickly. But Thomas Mitchell was proving to be far more formidable than anyone had anticipated, and the element of surprise was working entirely in his favor. While this chaos unfolded in the corridor, Prince George was navigating the secret passage system that his grandfather had shown him during their private games of hide-and-seek. The passages were dark and cramped, designed more for emergency evacuation than comfort, but the 10-year-old moved through them with determination that would have made his military ancestors proud. Behind him, he could hear muffled sounds of struggle and shouting, which told him that the brave guardsman was fighting to protect him. George's young heart was filled with both fear and gratitude as he crawled through the narrow tunnel toward what he hoped would be safety. The passage eventually opened into a small chamber that housed emergency communication equipment. George had been shown this room before but never imagined he would need to use it in a real crisis. With trembling fingers, he activated the direct line to the Royal Protection Command headquarters in London. "This is Prince George," he said into the microphone, his young voice steady despite the circumstances. "I am calling from the emergency communications room at Windsor Castle. There are bad people trying to hurt me and Nanny Margaret. They have someone who looks like our security commander, but something is very wrong. Please send help immediately." The response was swift and professional. "Prince George, this is Commander Roberts at Protection Command. Can you tell me your exact location and the nature of the threat?" "I'm in the secret room behind the library on the second floor," George replied. "There's a man who says he's Commander Harrison, but he's with people I don't recognize, and they were talking about containing the situation and making sure there are no witnesses. The guardsmen from outside tried to help me, but now they're fighting in the corridor." Back in the corridor, Thomas was holding his own against increasingly desperate opponents, but he knew he couldn't maintain his defensive position indefinitely. Peterson had recovered from his collision with the wall and was now coordinating with Davies to overwhelm the lone guard through sheer numbers. Harrison finally entered the fray directly, producing a weapon that made Thomas's blood run cold. A military-grade tranquilizer gun designed to incapacitate targets quickly and quietly. This was clearly not standard security equipment, which confirmed that whatever was happening went far beyond a simple kidnapping attempt. "This has gone on long enough," Harrison snarled. "Take him down." Thomas realized that his best chance now was to create as much noise and disruption as possible. If Prince George had managed to call for help, then every second of delay increased the chances that legitimate authorities would arrive in time. He began shouting at the top of his lungs, hoping to alert any remaining loyal staff members who might be within hearing. "Security breach in the family quarters. Royal family under attack. All loyal personnel respond immediately." His shouts echoed through the stone corridors, and somewhere in the castle, other staff members began to take notice that something was very wrong. The head cook heard the commotion from 2 floors below and immediately contacted the main gate, where other guards were beginning to realize that Guardsman Mitchell had abandoned his post without explanation. Meanwhile, Prince George's emergency call had triggered the most serious security response in the Royal Protection Command's history. Within minutes, armed response teams were racing toward Windsor Castle from 3 different directions, while helicopters prepared to provide aerial support. Commander Roberts maintained contact with the young prince, guiding him through emergency procedures while coordinating the response. "George, you've done exactly the right thing by calling us. Help is on the way, but I need you to stay in that safe room until we tell you it's secure to come out." "What about Nanny Margaret?" George asked, his voice betraying his worry for the woman who had protected him. "And the guard who tried to help me? His name is Thomas, and he was very brave." "We're going to help everyone, Prince George, but right now the most important thing is keeping you safe so we can focus on neutralizing the threat." In the corridor, Thomas was beginning to show the effects of fighting multiple opponents in a confined space. A glancing blow from Davies had left him with a cut above his left eye, and Peterson had managed to grab hold of his rifle during the struggle. But the guardsman's determination remained unshaken, fueled by the knowledge that he was possibly the only thing standing between conspirators and a defenseless child. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance told everyone that the situation was escalating beyond anyone's original plans. Harrison's carefully orchestrated operation was falling apart, and he knew that capture would mean life imprisonment at best. "Abort the operation," he ordered his companions. "We need to evacuate immediately." But Thomas Mitchell had no intention of letting these men escape to threaten the royal family another day. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, he summoned his last reserves of strength for one final effort to keep the conspirators contained until help arrived. The young guardsman who had started the day as an anonymous sentry was about to become a hero whose name would be remembered in the annals of royal protection history. The sound of boots thundering up the main staircase announced the arrival of the Royal Protection Command's emergency response team. Commander Roberts himself led the charge, followed by 12 of the most elite security officers in Britain, all armed and trained for exactly this type of crisis. Thomas Mitchell heard them coming and felt a surge of relief that nearly overwhelmed his remaining strength. He had done it. He had held the line long enough for proper help to arrive. But his ordeal wasn't over yet, as Harrison and his conspirators made one final desperate attempt to fight their way out of the castle. Armed police, Drop your weapons. Immediately! The authoritative shout echoed through the corridor as the response team rounded the corner and took in the chaotic scene. Thomas, bloodied but still standing, was wrestling with Peterson for control of his rifle, while Davies attempted to drag an unconscious Nanny Margaret from the prince's room. Harrison, seeing that escape was now impossible, made a decision that revealed the true desperation of his situation. Rather than surrender, he turned his tranquilizer weapon toward the approaching officers, clearly prepared to fight to the end. But Thomas Mitchell had one last act of heroism left in him. Despite his exhaustion and injuries, he broke free from his struggle with Peterson and tackled Harrison just as the corrupt commander was about to fire at the response team. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, the tranquilizer gun skittering away across the ancient stone. Within seconds, the elite officers had the situation completely under control. Peterson and Davies were on the ground in restraints, while Harrison found himself surrounded by weapons and stern faces that offered no possibility of escape. The conspiracy that had threatened the heart of the British monarchy was over. Commander Roberts immediately began coordinating the aftermath, while his team secured the scene. Medical team to the second-floor corridor immediately. We have injured personnel requiring attention. He spoke into his radio before turning to Thomas. Guardsman Mitchell, you've shown extraordinary courage today. Medical attention is on the way. Thomas, now that the immediate danger had passed, felt the full weight of what had happened settling on his shoulders. Sir, Prince George, is he safe? And what about his nanny? Prince George is secure in the emergency communications room exactly where he should be. As for Margaret, she's unconscious but breathing. The medical team will assess her condition immediately. From the hidden panel behind the bookshelf, a small voice called out tentatively, "Is it safe to come out now? Is Thomas okay?" Commander Roberts smiled, despite the seriousness of the situation. "Yes, Your Highness, it's safe now. Would you like to come and thank the brave guardsman who protected you?" Prince George emerged from his hiding place looking remarkably composed for a 10-year-old who had just survived a kidnapping attempt. He walked straight to Thomas, who was sitting against the wall while a medic tended to his injuries. "Thank you for believing me," the young prince said simply. "I knew I could trust you when I saw you standing so straight and strong at your post. Grandfather always says the guards are the bravest people in England, and now I know he's right." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked at the boy whose quick thinking and courage had saved not just himself, but potentially prevented a much larger conspiracy against the royal family. "You're the brave one, Your Highness. You did everything perfectly." The investigation that followed would reveal that Harrison had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service months earlier, with plans to kidnap Prince George and use him as leverage in international negotiations. The conspiracy involved several other members of the castle's security staff and had been in planning stages for over a year. Nanny Margaret recovered fully from her ordeal and was later awarded the Royal Victorian Medal for her protection of Prince George. She would go on to serve the family for many more years, though she never forgot the morning when her young charge showed wisdom and bravery far beyond his years. Thomas Mitchell was promoted to sergeant and personally commended by the king himself. More importantly to Thomas, he was assigned to the personal protection detail for Prince George, ensuring that the bond of trust formed during that terrifying morning would continue to serve the royal family. The tourists, who had watched a seemingly statue-like guard suddenly come to life and abandon his post, never knew they had witnessed the first moments of one of the most significant security breaches in modern royal history. To them, it had simply been an unusual moment during their castle visit. But for Prince George, Thomas Mitchell, and everyone involved in protecting the royal family, that October morning became a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty require breaking the rules, trusting your instincts, and believing that a child's cry for help should never be ignored. Years later, when Prince George was older and could fully understand what had happened, he would often tell the story of how a simple Morse code signal and one guardsman's willingness to abandon his post had saved his life. And Thomas Mitchell, by then a respected senior officer in the Royal Protection Command, would always emphasize that the real hero of the story was a 10-year-old boy who kept his head in a crisis and knew exactly how to ask for help when it mattered most. The hidden sign from Prince George had indeed stopped the royal guard cold, but it had also started a chain of events that proved the unbreakable bond between the British royal family and those sworn to protect them, no matter the cost.